everyone, this is Miriam and welcome to a new interview by Lumturo. For those among you who aren't familiar with this project, Lumturo is an initiative created by a small group of students that aims to shed a light on international issues. Every month is dedicated to exploring a specific continent. In this new cycle, June will be about Oceania, and in particular today with our guest, we're going to talk about Australia and Australians living abroad. This is why today with us we have Shanali, an international model from Melbourne who has worked in the major fashion capitals, Paris, New York and Milan, and it is exactly in Milan that I met her a couple of years ago. Hello Shanali, thank you very much for being here today. To start, I would like to let you introduce yourself on what has been your personal journey from your hometown to what prompted you to leave your country. Have you always wanted to pursue a career abroad, or it was something that kind of happened along the way?
Okay, so I guess just like a little bit of background. I've been modeling now for over 8 years, like almost 9 years now. And within that, I've traveled quite a bit and twice now to Milan. In the time that I met you, I was there on stay for like just over a month. But travel with modeling is pretty much an accepted part of your journey. Like once everybody does it a bit differently, but it's kind of, it's pretty much a part of like the journey of it all. So you would definitely start considering it after you've, wherever your hometown is, after you've been modeling for a little bit and you've gotten a bit of experience. Then you chat to your agent or your agent chats to you about which places in the world. So obviously there's, different girls will be suitable for different places. So it really also depends where you travel is based on how you look as well. So different markets you'll do better in. So for me, my pathway was always going towards Europe because I guess like you can either go into an Asian market, a European market or an American market, and me being like my background is I'm half Australian and half Fijian Indian, so my mum is of Indian descent from Fiji, which is, if anyone doesn't know, that's a Pacific island very close to Australia. But yeah, so I was always sort of geared up to go towards Europe, and that was the market that my managers and also I wanted to travel to Europe more than I did to America or Asia. So it worked out very nicely for me. And actually Milan was a place I had really been wanting to go to for a long time. And then in 2019, I got to do that. And I did fall in love with the city, and I can't wait to go back at some point. So yeah, so hopefully once all this crazy business is finished, I do hope to travel again. But yeah, so my travel through modeling was sort of something, I worked a little bit at home, and then you kind of have to go through a few obstacles. You have to have you have to have shot like with certain people or done certain jobs, and eventually you can get to the point where you can consider going overseas, and you have to pick up an agency overseas. So there are a few things that you need to obstacles you need to go through before you can. But yeah, a lot of girls do travel, some don't, but it's very common, considering Australia is so isolated, and in order to excel your career, you can do well just in Australia, but then you kind of get typecasted as a certain model. So like when you go to Europe and you work in Europe, then you have a certain amount of clout that you get from going and doing work in Europe, and then you return and you're an international model, and it's a whole thing. So.
Okay. Yeah, I guess so, because I think that Europe has still a pretty dominance in the fashion industry. What do you think?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. 100%. And I don't ever see that changing. Like there's, the market has definitely leveled out. Like there's not so much dominance with Paris anymore. And with the world becoming more globalized anyway, it just means that international borders for things like, you know, collaboration between people is just so much easier now anyway. So the city's aesthetic or like the type of people that might go and work in a city, like traditionally at, you know, at certain times in certain markets, you know, I maybe would not have been able to go and work, just based on, like, you know, my ethnicity was not always the right time to be working and to be sort of like working realistically where I can, you know, make money and work a lot. So yeah, so the, you know, with times changing, it means markets are changing and there's more possibilities, more places to go to as well. So yeah.
Okay, perfect. So moving on, let's talk about the main challenges that you had to face working in Europe and especially in Italy. Did you ever experience any stereotype related to your nationality, and what were the main cultural shocks?
Well, I was thinking about this question when we chatted about it, and I thought to myself how, like, I remember my manager preparing me to come to Italy in particular, and sort of like when they prepare you, they try to tell you like the experiences from people who have had experiences in these cities. And I remember her telling me, like, don't expect it to be anything like Australia. Like, it's so much more harsh. You sort of like, especially with a language barrier, when you're going into a place where you can't understand what they're saying, there's a sense of sometimes when you're traveling and you're doing these castings, you know, they'll chat amongst themselves and you have no idea what they're saying, but you know, you can get the gist of things generally. But I remember my manager saying to me that it was going to be very cutthroat in Italy because they tell it like it is and they're not going to mince the words. And for me, I expected that because I just think that Europeans in general, compared to Australians, are a lot more direct in the way that they communicate. And Australians are very, we have this saying where like Australians like to save face, which means like we're very polite and we don't really like to offend people. And this is just a cultural thing. So if, say, for example, if I go for a casting in Australia and, you know, they don't like me or they don't want to cast me, but they don't want to offend me, they'll be like, you know, babe, like, we'll be in touch, you know, don't, like, it's really nice to meet you. And there's no indication of, like, they'll be really nice to you and not give you any indication of whether they like you or not. Whereas I suppose, generally speaking, my experience in Europe is very much more like, especially when you're going, like, especially when you go for runway castings and there's very little time and there's no time to waste. So they kind of just like, they'll tell you like it is. But personally, for myself, I actually prefer this way of communication rather than like being polite. I like, that's, you know, the type of person I am. But it is a cultural shock for some people when you come to a city, you don't speak the language and people have very different ways of communicating to you, and you have to deal with like a lot of rejection as well. So it's kind of, it can be a lot for some people, and it is a tough job sometimes when you have to, like, it's tough on your self-esteem. So you have to just be able to overlook like certain things. But I suppose in terms of like cultural shock, it's just, yeah, I mean, like, it's a very different place to Australia. And I think that's where there are certain things that I really love, especially about being in Italy, that maybe some other people wouldn't like. So it really depends on the person. But I do just remember my manager really being direct and telling me, like, you know, it's not going to be like a piece of cake like it is in Australia sometimes. They're not going to know you. They're not going to have any loyalty to you. They're going to tell you like it is. So, yeah.
It was also interesting in knowing, since you talked about the fact that you have mixed origins, right? I was very interested in knowing how people perceived you having your personal physical traits. There is an Australian type that it is like stereotyped or not?
Yeah, definitely. But I did just want to say something about what I previously said. And actually, as I said before, my manager did try to prepare me for this different market. And I think because she did that, when I actually did experience the market, I actually had a very positive experience. And I didn't necessarily I didn't have a negative experience about clients in Italy. I found everyone very friendly, but I also think it was because, there would have been times when maybe someone who couldn't read somebody as well as maybe I can, or couldn't understand the difference in cultural things, that would have interpreted the way that people say things as rude. So I think it just depends on how, like, I have traveled in Europe before, and I also tried to understand a bit of Italian, a bit of the way that people go about expressing themselves. And I think some people could interpret the way that I experience things as being rude. So it also really comes down to the person. But yeah, I just wanted to say that.
I completely get what you said, and it is good to know that we should, as you said, be prepared for difference, to be able to understand another point of view, not just judge it as bad, but trying to, change our perspective and see it the other way around.
Yeah, I mean, whenever I did experience things where I thought someone was being rude to me when I was overseas or in a place that was foreign, I suppose I always try to think of it in a manner of like, okay, I'm the foreign person here. They're trying to communicate to me. So I always try to cut people a little bit of slack because I'm the one who can't speak their language. So, there's a certain amount of like grace that I do give people. But I'll answer your question as well. So I suppose in terms of Australian stereotypes, it's the stereotype is like a beach girl. It's like blonde, sort of blue eyes,
I guess.
wavy hair. Pretty much, I guess, the opposite to what I am. But if anyone knows anything about Australia, it's that it's very culturally diverse, and the type of Australian is a very like stereotypical traditional idea of what an Australian is. And of course, I know many of those girls, they do exist and they do work well, but they are for a certain type of like, those kinds of girls get cast a lot for swimwear and for beachy types of brands. So there is definitely a market for that. But I don't necessarily feel like I ever got stereotyped when I was overseas. I didn't ever feel like anybody was like, oh, you're from Australia. Like there was nobody surprised about that. It's just people are actually more interested in my ethnic origin, or like where I like, people wouldn't assume I'm Australian because of the way I look. So they're like, what's your ethnic background? So actually a lot of people aren't very interested in the fact that I'm from Australia. It's more so like where my mum is from, which is, I was born in Australia. I wasn't born in Fiji, but that's kind of the thing that, because in like, my industry is based on looks. So the way that you look isn't like, that's who you are on paper. So they're like, we want to know what box you fit into. So where are you from? What box can we put you in, basically? So yeah.
And I'm curious about knowing, do you find it kind of rude in the sense that when I meet someone that has clearly a look that I associate more with other like origins than what they tell me, I do not usually ask, because I have the impression that I am kind of, putting them out from their nationality. You know what I mean? So I always wonder.
I try not to. If I want to know someone's origins, I try to let it come naturally in conversation. So I don't like to ask people directly, because it is definitely a question that I have had my whole career. And I don't necessarily find it rude, because I think I have been asked it so many times, and just when you get used to a job that is so much based on looks, like I expect the question, I understand the curiosity for people. maybe it is rude, like maybe there's a better way that people could go about it, but I'm just so used to it that it's not really a thing that I'm bothered by anymore. People like it annoys me a little bit when people, it's the first thing they want to know about you, in terms of like, instead of getting to know you or like chat to you for a little bit and become familiar with you and then ask you, which is the more polite way to go about it. A lot of people directly just be like, oh, like, what's your origins? But also when you're doing castings and you're literally like in front of someone for 2 minutes, I understand if they're like, what's your background? So there's like different settings, I suppose, you know, as opposed to a shoot where I'm with someone for the whole day and that's the first thing they ask me. There's a difference between that and doing a casting where I'm there for only a few minutes. So yeah.
Okay. And now I would like to reverse my previous question. So before leaving, did you had any stereotype about Italians or Europeans overall? And how did your perception of us change having the opportunity to live in our country?
Did I have any stereotypes going into it? I don't think so. I think I probably, the only thing that, you know, there's a stereotype with the Italian or the Milan fashion industry that it's quite traditional, which I think I have maintained because it is still quite traditional in terms of, I think diversity is like in modeling is only become it's very recent. So like still when I was doing castings, I did still feel that I was the minority in terms of like color, but I know that it's improved recently. It's not like I was the only girl of color. There was definitely girls around, but there's still the majority is Caucasians or like, you know, girls who aren't of color. So, but in terms of like, but even just going beyond like skin color, traditional in the sense that like edit, like the styling of things and the makeup trends and the hair trends and things like that, I think is still quite traditional in Italy. But it's also a reason that I personally love Italy, because women still wear heels around and there's still women like dressing up in suits, and there's still a sense of pride in dress, which I don't find many other places in the world, and it's something that I really value. So yes, like there is still a stereotype around Milan being, or like Italians being in general, the industry being a little bit behind like the trends, but I also think that's totally okay, because it's like there are other areas in the world like Tokyo, and there are places in the world that are doing things that are much more forward. There are markets for that, but there are not always markets for more traditional things. So it's not really a criticism, it's just like that's how it is, and I think it will be like that. Like it's nice to have that niche still there.
Okay, so we have come at the end of this interview, and for last, I thought it could be fun to ask you if you want to share with us a particular expression, figure of speech popular in Australia that you would like to export in Italy, like part of the Australian slang, something.
I was having a think about this, but it's funny because I suppose you're not always aware of the things that I would personally say that would be like, you know, it depends on where you are in Australia and how much sort of sayings you use. But like having grown up in a city, I think my speech is quite, or my language is very like mainstream. And I don't necessarily know like how many things I say that are unusual, but I'm sure everybody that's been listening, hopefully everyone can understand what I'm saying and I'm not speaking too fast. That's definitely a thing that people say Australians speak really fast and you can't understand what they're saying. But I think there's nothing specific I managed to think about, but I think that Australians are very, like, we have a reputation for being very laid back and very relaxed about things. So I think, and I think I experience this also when I'm traveling and I meet other Australians while I'm modeling, and the way that we go about things, or if you don't get a job or something, it's very much there's just a more relaxed attitude about it. And so I think in general, I'm sorry I couldn't come up with any
No,
phrases, but I think
no,
that there's an attitude there that we definitely have, that I think which I think is probably born from maybe not being such an old country. Like, we're very laid back because we can be, and it's our lifestyle. So yeah, I would just say in general, like, I think the way that I would go about things when I'm traveling and experiencing different cultures is very relaxed.
okay, no, it is interesting because I think that in Italy, and well, in France is even bigger, but in Italy we have like a polite Italian, like the one that you would use in a more professional setting. And we also have kind of a slang, something that maybe, at school you wouldn't learn, but living there are certain expressions that are part of the slang, and they are so much used in everyday life. And that's why I was curious to know if also the Australian English had that dimension as well.
Well, actually, no, which is a big part of, Australian English is very similar to, like, British English. But I think that they're really, like, within English, because I know, like, I have a little basic French and Italian, and I do know that there is a level of formality which we just do not have. And there's, like, if I think about the way if I'm working with a client in Australia or even overseas, if I think about the way that I talk to them as opposed to with friends and stuff, it's very similar. Like, it's more professional, of course. I'm not just gonna, like, tell all and be swearing and whatever, but it's somewhat still of a general tone. But I think there's definitely a bigger difference with some European or Latin-based languages where there's that formality that you just automatically have through language. So yeah, so we're laid back in many, many different ways in Australia, including language. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious about one thing because, of course, before interviewing you, I did a little bit of research, and I found like a kind of expression that they say is used in Australia, but I ask you, that is, she'll be good, or she'll be right, to be that everything is going to be all right.
Yeah, that's definitely, that's maybe not something I would necessarily say, but it's a saying I do hear. It's kind of more of a blokey, like, I don't know whether you know that word, but like a bloke is like someone who's maybe from a more rural part of Australia. It's kind of like a dude or something like that. So I would say that's more of a term, like a saying that you get someone who's more like a tradesman would say, or like I would say in a joking way to my friends, but it's not something that that's in my vocabulary, just kind of on the ordinary. But like, she'll be right is very very common thing to say, but just with certain people. I think when we're being like, and even the way that people say it, like, she'll be right, and sort of saying the whole thing as like one word kind of thing, there's no real emphasis. So like, that's another way the language kind of is like lazy, because people just don't pronounce things properly as well. Yeah.
Okay, now I have understood a little bit, because I think it's also interesting to see also differences in languages, because they clarify about also the culture as well.
Well, that's why it's actually like, I try to think of things that it's a bit hard for me to think, because I suppose the way I talk is more like I grew up in the city, and my friends were not necessarily, like, it's not necessarily people from the country, and people who are more like from rural places in Australia tend to use more slang and more like, common sayings or things you Google and see what Australians say. So for me, it's a little bit hard to actually come up with those things because it's not necessarily, I don't hear it all the time, and I'm not really friends too much with people who are like kind of more rural. So yeah.
In Italy, there is another level in the language. I said to you that there is the slang, but apart from the slang that is spoken in the cities, there are dialects. So
Yes.
Every region has its own language. So there is another layer in Italy into the language.
Yeah, well, I suppose that I sort of find that out more about that every time I do travel, because you talk more in depth with people about the way that they speak, and can you tell where this person is from and how they speak. And it's fascinating to me in such a small country that there are so many different dialects, because in Australia we're such a big country and there are different dialects, you could say, but they're very spread out. And it just shows because our population density is not so much. So like when you have a lot of people in like a small and more tribal sort of, so to speak, then you do have more like, okay, we're going to sound like our own little community and we don't want to sound like anyone else. And we're going to use these words. So there's like not necessarily that sense of like kind of pride in your own community in Australia. It's like I'll sound like, whoever, doesn't matter. I'm Australian and I'm proud to be from Melbourne, but nobody would be able to really tell that I was from Melbourne in Australia, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you very much. But I'm so happy because you gave us so much material and you were so great. You were amazing. Literally, you gave me so much hints about so many interesting things. So thank you very much for being part of this little project, because we are very little, but you were so kind to help us. And I hope to hear from you soon.
Yeah, sounds good. Let me know. Thanks.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Bye.